and Bilingual Research Center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in person events and instituted these online webinars. We've been doing them weekly since June. With our previous revenue generating programs suspended, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. I want to get right into today's program. Very exciting topic on unions in the new economic reality, featuring Bill Fletcher and Jane McAlevey. Let me just say a word of introduction of our speakers, and then I'll turn the program over to them. Um, Jane McAlevey is an organizer, author, and scholar. She's currently a senior policy fellows at the University of California at Berkeley's Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. Her third book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy, argues that despite, if not because of, the withering attacks on working people from the US Supreme Court, conservative state and local governments, and the corporate class, the survival of American democracy depends on rebuilding unions. She has a very interesting article that appeared just this last week in The Nation, and I highly recommend it to you. Oop, I thought that was it. Nope. um, I was just going to show you the article. Oh, there we are. Why unions must recommit to expanding their base. Mobilizing our base is never a good idea, especially when the right wing and the Trump forces continue to mobilize. So that's probably the vein in which she will speak. But our first speaker, we welcome back Bill Fletcher Jr. He has been an activist since his teen years. He's worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the national AFL-CIO. Fletcher is executive editor of globalafricanworker.com, a past president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and in the leadership of several other projects. Bill is the co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. He's the co-author of Solidarity Divided and author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 other myths about unions, as well as the author of a mystery novel, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. Well, Bill will be our first speaker, and following him, we'll turn the mic to Jane, and then there will be a Q&A where you'll all get to ask your questions. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Cliff, and good afternoon to everyone. And I appreciate very much being invited to do this. And I especially look forward to doing something jointly with my friend Jane, who is an outstanding thinker and even a better friend. In the interest of time, I have 6 points that I want to raise for your consideration, as Rod Serling would say. The first is about the moment in which we find ourselves. So there's the moment globally speaking, and then there's the moment nationally speaking. The moment globally speaking is a moment of a clash of tectonic plates between the environmental crisis and the economic crisis. And this clash of tectonic plates has brought about the constant level of anxiety that the world's population has been facing, and the political and social destabilization that we see in country after country, which has called into question economic systems and social and political systems. One aspect of that has been the global rise of right-wing populism, including but not limited to neo-fascism. And the right-wing populism has been in part a response to the anxiety produced and the devastation produced by neoliberalism. But it's also been about a combination of changing demographics, particularly in, but not exclusively in Europe and North America, and the sense of danger, the creation of large populations, redundant populations, and the weakening of the left. Particularly, actually beginning quite well before the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And so the moment in the United States, we have seen the rise of right-wing populism, and most recently, the coup attempt in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January, which was for many of us quite predictable. But unfortunately, for many people in the US left, there was a level of denial of the extent and danger of right-wing populism, and a sense that there was an equivalence in the danger presented to the working class between right-wing populism on the one hand and neoliberal centrist Democrats on the other. Thus, many people, at least initially, wanted to sit out the election, and with the idea of essentially a plague on both houses, at least until about early September of 2020, when dawn broke on Marblehead for millions of people, realizing what the consequences of a Trump victory could be. So even though the coup attempt was defeated, even though Trump is supposed to leave by the 20th of January, none of this means that this moment has changed fundamentally.
Going to turn the show on? Okay.
Somebody needs to go on mute. Okay, so none of that has changed the fundamentals of the situation, because we're dealing a mass right-wing populist movement. And as my wife said very well, very cogently, Trump is the rattle on the tail of the rattlesnake. He's not the snake. The snake has been permeating the system for years and has been poisoning it. My second point, the organized labor in the United States has been paralyzed in the face of right-wing populism. And this is in part the result of years of denial of the necessity to address issues of race, national oppression, and male supremacy and right-wing populism within our ranks. The restriction of the labor movement to the traditional Gompers framework of wages, hours, and working conditions has failed on its own terms, but it has particularly failed in this immediate context, in that labor leadership and the framework of labor has not been able to grapple with what to do with a rising right-wing populist movement that in many cases would take themes from the left and themes from organized labor, which goes to my third point. Organized labor has had an incomplete critique of neoliberal globalization, that the focus, I would argue, and some debate me on this, the focus that much of the labor movement had on trade agreements as being the cutting edge of neoliberal globalization, and the almost exclusive focus on the impact of trade agreements, neoliberal trade agreements, on the US working class, actually played into the hands of the right-wing populists. In the 2016 campaign, one of the things that many labor people just simply did not know how to respond to was workers saying, well, wait a minute, Trump is saying the same thing that you guys have been saying. You know, he's talking about changing the trade agreements. And because of the narrowness of labor's critique of neoliberal globalization, there was very little that they could say in response except, oops. Fourth point, labor fragmentation. The trade union movement has been in a process of fragmenting for quite some time. It really hit a point in 2005 when the Service Employees International Union led a split out of the AFL-CIO, a split that I argued at the time and continue to was fundamentally unprincipled. I don't mean simply it was bad. I'm saying it was without principle, that there was nothing really at stake other than who was going to be paying per capita, because the differences between the two sides were never fleshed out in a way where there could actually be a progressive resolution. And the splitters, although claiming to lead in the direction of a revitalized labor movement, have in fact led nowhere and have to a great extent weakened and I would say disintegrated. But one of the things that happened as a result of this is sort of reminiscent of the aftermath of the coup against Gorbachev in 1991 in the then Soviet Union, that after the coup, certain things were set in motion that simply could not be turned around. And there was a fragmentation that started to permeate throughout the entire Soviet system. Much the same has happened in organized labor in the United States, that after the split, the fragmentation continued to unfold. And there was less and less connection between the different affiliates of national AFL-CIO. Many of the larger affiliates started operating more on their own or creating their own vehicles, such as during the last couple of election cycles, paying very little attention to what the National AFL-CIO's electoral program has been, and more creating their own programs. We've had also a couple of disaffiliations, the International Longshore Warehouse Union on the West Coast and the International Longshoremen's Association on the East Coast were two of the more recent disaffiliations. And, you know, it's characteristic of the moment, neither side could really explain in a way that passed the straight face test why these disaffiliations were happening and how it was going to strengthen either the members of their respective unions or the labor movement as a whole. My fifth point, one of the things that the moment should teach us is the strategic importance of organizing the South and the Southwest, which organized labor has largely failed to do since the 1940s, and some would argue even prior to that, that the way that the economy has shifted over the last 60 plus years, the growth of foreign transplants, particularly in the Southeast, and the economic importance of the entire Sunbelt region should have made the South and the Southwest key strategic targets. But there's another reason for the importance of the South and the Southwest, and that's political. One of the things that's been demonstrated regularly is that where there are unions, there is more than likely, there's a greater likelihood that the workers and their families will vote in a more progressive direction. Now, there's not a one-to-one correspondence, because obviously in the trade union movement, somewhere between 25 and 30% of union members tend to vote Republican on a regular basis. But I'm saying as an overall tendency, and as one that could be examined and identified from looking at the history of the South, where you have had strong unions, food, tobacco, and agricultural workers, the woodworkers, Unite and others, you had a tendency towards a more progressive direction in politics. One could say it was almost like the creation of base areas. So the strategic importance of organizing the South and the Southwest is not simply one of the need of rebuilding the union movement and replenishing our members. It's about really rethinking unionism and the necessity for a social justice unionism that is attempting to transform the politics and economics of the entire country, but particularly with the South and the Southwest. Finally, there's the question of organizing the unemployed, which has been a hobby horse that I've been on top of for quite a number of years. One of the things that the coup attempt should remind us is that there's two segments of the population you never want to leave unorganized. One is the unemployed, and the other are veterans. Because in the absence of organizing them, it's not that they're going to stay disorganized. It is more likely that they're going to fall prey to the right wing. And the fascists in particular have programs for organizing the unemployed and the veterans. And the failure of progressives in a coherent way, and I particularly put the focus on organized labor, to organize the unemployed, we do so, it's a disservice. It's a disservice to the unemployed, it's a disservice to the rest of the working class, and it's a disservice to progressive politics. The unemployed, and in moments such as the one we're in, with the economic collapse, the unemployed need to be organized. And I'm not talking about charity work. Charity has its place, but I'm talking about the need to organize the unemployed, particularly in mobilizing around the Green New Deal, the demand for the Green New Deal, for the creation of different approaches towards economic development, job creation. This is the moment. And it's a process or a project that needs to be undertaken by the AFL-CIO. There's not an individual union realistically that's going to take this up. But the National AFL-CIO, State Federation, Central Labor Councils need to look at organizing the unemployed as part of our job of organizing the working class and introducing a different and more advanced form of trade unionism. And I will stop there and turn it over to Jane. Thank you.
And the crowd goes wild. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
It's always really good to pull up to any microphone anywhere near, which generally these days, as we all know, means anywhere near someone on a screen. So I want to thank the hosts for inviting Bill and I to share some thoughts with you this afternoon. I guess for starters, I want to just say I don't think there's a word that Bill just uttered that I don't fully support and embrace. And this, I think, has been true for quite some time, Bill. Not sure, but pretty much since we met. So that's the good news. But I want to speak a little bit to, at the strategy level, some of how I envision sort of implementing some of the really smart ideas that Bill has just laid out for us in terms of what's urgent. The far right, obviously urgent, and it's been urgent for a long time. It suddenly exploded onto everyone's, onto the radar screen, right, in terms of the attack on the Capitol on the 6th. And I think that the framing that Bill laid out of the tectonic plates of the environmental and economic crisis is absolutely correct. So I want to draw a line from how Bill laid out a sort of thesis of his 6 points to a way that I think about how we implement that in a sort of mass political education and mass organizing program. And I think I will take the chance, as Cliff had mentioned, to just talk a little bit about the article I wrote that's in The Nation magazine this week. And just for starters, the editors asked for us to write a piece about Biden's first 100 days. That's the theme of the issue in which the article I wrote sits. And of course, this was weeks and weeks ago when we were all still worrying desperately about protecting the results when I first sat down to write that article. And this story is relevant a little bit because I sort of called up the editor and I said, the truth is, I don't think there's going to be that much different to say that I'm going to say about what Biden should do in the first 100 days than what any of your writers will say. I'd rather talk about what the labor movement should be doing in the first 100 days, because that to me is frankly needs a lot more attention than the sort of wishes we all have for Biden's first 100 days. So I think I want to go there because it builds on the really smart ideas that Bill was just laying out. So my focus in the piece was on base expansion, what I call base expansion, which is very different than sort of activism or advocacy or mobilizing. It's about how do we, as a progressive movement, as a left, as a trade union movement, as the left inside of it, how do we keep our focus on bringing new people who are not engaged at all by any of us traditionally into the universe of our progressive movement, which is the line that I've been very focused on between what we call sort of organizing and mobilizing in most of my public commentary for the last decade or so. But I want to take a bridge and move it into what I call whole worker organizing today. As we know, 74 million people, more or less, voted for a party that wants to kill them, and or a presidential candidate that was perfectly happy to let working class folks die, quite literally. And so when I think about the work of the trade union movement, I mean, people were heralding that Biden got, this historic record turnout. And the point I keep trying to make is that someone else got a historic record turnout too. His name was Donald Trump. And he's a racist, misogynist, murderous grifter. So what does it mean to us that this guy just got 74 million votes and that our side got 6 million more, but in the scheme of the millions of votes, it's uncomfortably close, right? The percentage of the vote share that actually went to Trump versus to Biden's folks. So, and bringing it even back further to when Bill and I first met, which was in the 1990s, in the late 1990s at the National AFL-CIO when we both were working. I was heading up a project called the Stanford Organizing Project. And when I came into the trade union movement, I came in as the daughter of a sort of left-wing politician. So I had a lot of experience with campaigns and trade unions in my childhood. And I came into an effort that was in a red region of a blue state. There's a lot of red regions, what we would call red, right? Meaning conservative region in an otherwise sort of Democratic Party voting state. I can say in California, the entire Central Valley is what often tanks or slows or stops most of the progressive change in terms of ballot initiatives. So many states in the United States have these red zones, these conservative regions. So I was placed into a conservative region in a blue state in the late 1990s, charged with what they thought was a sort of losing strategy, which was how to organize in the suburbs in a conservative Republican voting region. So suburbs, Republican voting. And people thought that that was a bit of a setup for like sort of a recipe for disaster. And to fast forward to how it connects to the work that Bill is talking about, since I had experience running political campaigns, I had experience growing up in a trade union household, but I had experience as a community organizer. When I became a trade union organizer full-time, what was different for me was that I automatically saw, because of my previous community organizing experience, I automatically saw that every worker in a campaign had a whole set of relationships that was outside of work. They didn't just come to work and live at work, and their life didn't just exist at work. Their life actually existed outside of work and at work. And so my vantage point on workers as a trade union organizer and eventually negotiator and yada, yada, was that there's a whole person. And I just began to call it whole worker organizing. In the old days, I think we would just call it really, really, really good organizing back in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s and 60s. We wouldn't give it a different name. We would just say that's what it takes to win. Right now we have to dress things up and re-explain them. So in some ways, I want to describe to you what I think it takes to win. And the 1930s, by the way, there was plenty of fascists running around and plenty of white nationalists running around the United States that we were also contending with, right? In an equally fraught period globally, which was the 30s and 40s. So, so from my view, the way to approach workers and working class people, whether it's the unemployed, the underemployed, is one, we have to sort of reunify the trade union movement in all the ways that Bill was articulating. It's fragmented, it gets completely decimated even since the time he and I came into it together in terms of the unions that no longer coordinate and talk with each other. But from my view, there's a way in which we don't sort of sort out what we think of as radical political education as someone else's job. That work happens in every organizing campaign, every strike campaign, and every contract campaign. So when I look at, and I want to explain just a couple of steps about how that works, practically speaking. when I'm organizing workers in a campaign, again, whether it's what we would call a renegotiation of an existing contract, where we have to rebuild everyone to like really high participation levels. Think about rebuilding like the Los Angeles Teachers Union to the 34,000 worker strike that they had in January of 2019. And that's the kind of organizing I'm talking about. Getting ready for a big strike, getting ready for a big organizing drive. There's a set of principles that union organizers, good ones, those people who win, there's a set of skills and methods that we've been using since, the 1920s, quite frankly, in the United States. They sound sharper now, they look different, but they follow the same fundamental line of thinking, which is first, we track and chart and understand and help workers come to build relationships across every single worker in every unit and every shift in the workplace. This is like the work that we do day in and day out. We help everyone understand who's connected to who across, let's say, a hospital, because most of my life has been doing hospital organizing. That work is really important work and really good work, but then on top of that, and where it goes to how do we deal with fascism, how do we deal with the far right, how do we deal with the many issues that are affecting workers and that are leaving people sort of open to be tapped and recruited or confused by a sort of populist, faux populist right-wing movement, we do a second set of things when we're engaging with workers, which is we begin to systematically chart all the relationships they have outside of work as well. Who's, if you're a Mexican audience, it's who's in your football club or who's in your soccer league, who's in your baseball club, who's in your little league, where do the parents, are they in a book club? Do they play on an adult team? Where do the kids, where do the parents of the adults go to church, if it's church or temple or synagogue or whatever it is? What are all those connections that workers have in their community? And as the trade union, we begin to work on a broad set of issues that are impacting the life of the worker, not just in work. So when Bill was referring to sort of wages, bread and butter issues and wages, the methods that I've been using are methods about expanding well beyond a set of narrow issues in the workplace to a broader set of issues that follow workers when they go home in the United States, which might be their water source is contaminated and polluted. It might be that the city plans to knock down the housing that they live in because it's in a gentrifying neighborhood. It might be, and I'm not talking about teachers unions now, it might be, let's say they're healthcare workers, that the local schools are falling apart because many are in the United States because of austerity and de-investment. But that's true in large parts of Europe and certainly all over the world, that there's been massive kind of global austerity happening that has positioned a far-right movement today in the US and globally to be in striking distance of power in a pretty frightening way again. So the whole worker organizing approach, sort of a method that I talk about in the article that was referenced by Cliff, is an approach that attempts in a very day in, day out, not just doing it because we're in a far right-wing crisis, but the approach is about unifying through the worker a set of issues they're confronting when they leave work and a set of issues they're confronting at work. And the process and the method and the approach helps workers begin to see the connection between their really crappy manager on the third shift in the nursing home, the mayor of the city, the CEO of the company, and the developers that are coming and putting in huge money to try and gentrify the neighborhood. And in a mature trade union movement, or the kind of trade union movement that we need right now in this minute, the union understands that it's in working on this whole set of issues and in helping connect the dots with workers between their bad third shift boss they don't like and the mayor and the developers who are trying to run them out of the city. That's the political education that ordinary people can come to conclusions on their own, that the system itself is deeply problematic, but they understand who's causing the pain in their life. In this instance, they would not get distracted by some simplistic message about trade agreements, which is something that Bill was raising, right? I mean, I definitely think when we think about political education with workers, the very first work I began to do full time on this was actually being recruited to go live in the US South to a place called the Highlander Center in the early 1990s, actually late 1980s. And I got recruited there because the unions were going to this historic institution called the Highlander Center, where I went to work, an adult education center. The unions were going and saying, we're hearing a lot of anti-Mexican racism because our members are starting to say the Mexicans are stealing our jobs, right? Because at that moment in history, we had had big factories disinvesting from the US Northeast that had gone to the US South to avoid unions. And at the point at which I was working in the US South in the late 1980s and early 1990s, those jobs were then quote unquote moving into the maquiladoras, into the northern Mexico US border region. And so the simple articulation was Mexicans are stealing our jobs. Well, we knew that that was wrong. And so the very first global education project I worked on with workers was actually still when I was working on the community organizer side, where these methods made a lot of sense to me in the US South. And we began to simply bring up the Mexican workers from the maquiladoras who were going into the plants that were leaving the US and have those workers have a conversation directly with the workers who were facing plant closings. And I can tell you very, very quickly that people went from having a sort of nationalist critique of trade deals to understanding there were a set of US global corporations who were destroying all of our lives, and that had to be the focus of our anger and of our work. So that's one example from the South. In the 1990s, when I go full circle to Connecticut, where the campaign I first was pioneering this in the US was, we also had workers going from thinking either only their third shift manager was the problem, but there wasn't a problem with the system, to quickly realizing when they understood the relationship between their employer, the mayor, and the gentrifiers, that there was something deeply wrong. It wasn't enough to realize there was something wrong. We actually had to have a campaign strategy and a method and a multifaceted political education and organizing program to stop the gentrification, to help those workers come to understand that there was a much bigger issue called neoliberal capitalism, which is not a way you would approach a worker in a campaign by saying, hey, I'm here to talk to you about neoliberal capitalism, right? That's not what we do. But there's a way to help workers pretty quickly get there and come to see it and understand it and build a different kind of trade union movement. And what I say in the Nation magazine article is, we were not out to build trade unions. We were out to build sophisticated, resilient communities with a progressive base in them that could stand up to the employer class at work, at home, and in political races and win. And so to me, that's where I think we urgently have to go. And I might just wrap up before we go to Q&A, coming to the point that Bill mentioned, which was vets, which I think is fascinating because I've been on a sort of multi-year, Bill knows some of this, I've been on a multi-year campaign to try and get either the unions working with vets literally in the US, for example, at the Veterans Administration, or with vets themselves. I think not organizing vets and veterans is a very serious mistake, not just for the reasons that Bill mentioned, but also because these are some seriously skilled people with some real grievances that if we approach them correctly, I think they break to be tremendous assets on our side. I've had endless veterans on strikes who within a second you realize who was it who understood troop deployment, troop movement, discipline, method. It was always the vets who were often working in the emergency departments and hospitals I was working in, or as technicians and techs when they came back from Iraq or Afghanistan in the recent years. So I think all of these issues work really well when we approach organizing and trade union work, looking at workers as whole people. And we don't separate what the issues and problems are when they punch the clock and leave work versus what the problems are at work. The working class needs confidence. It needs to rub its elbows together and realize if they're a white worker, that Black workers aren't the problem, that Latino workers aren't the problem, that Asian workers aren't the problem. And the approach to the work that we do helps people understand who the real problem is, which is not their coworker, and it's not even their third shift manager. It's a system that frankly is choking at most workers at this point. So I think I'll just stop there and then we can have a conversation or do Q&A.
Wow, that has been two fabulous presentations. And I'm sure that many of you have questions and comments that you want to put into our Q&A. Now, our audience is in two places. There are those here in the Zoom room, but there are also some who are who are watching on YouTube. And so if you are on YouTube, the way you get your question to us is by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. and I will then relay your questions to our speakers. If you are in the Zoom room, however, well, you can put your question more directly. And what I will do, I will put my screen on gallery view so I can see everybody. And if you have a question or comment you want to make, just wave at me and I'll call on you. If you have your camera off, of course, you need to put your camera on first, and as well as unmute yourself. So, who has the first question or comment? All right, David Rouse, I see his hand. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. First, I haven't heard two presentations as much on the money as I've just heard. Much thanks to both of you. I'm in far Southwest Virginia, having taught here for nearly 40 years, Wise County. It's the coal fields. When I came here, it was a Union Democratic county. In the 1990s, the Union lost jobs, it lost representation in government, and the extreme right has taken over this region. It's a very low population area. West Virginia is very much like it, and similar things have happened in West Virginia. Of course, both of you know Rich Trumka well, and Rich was UMWA president when he was fighting here against the Piston Coal Company successfully. But it's been downhill since then. What do you do in a rural area like the coal fields in order to revive that sense of unionism? I like what you said about organizing the unemployed, but what else? Either one of our speakers.
Jane.
Jane, you say Jane?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, good. Okay, here's what I would do. David, thank you for that good question. And certainly what you're saying represents a whole lot of the United States, to be honest. So coming right off of what I was just saying, in that region, my guess is that there are some veterans, just for starters. They're just given the population of Virginia and the way who joins the military exists, my guess is that there's some retired vets in that area. So I think a few things. One is, since organizing to me is all about human social relationships, right? That's fundamentally what organizing is and what building a base is. It's starting with what we know about human social relationships, and it's beginning to look for connections. So if I were you, I would probably, not in COVID, we wouldn't be knocking on the doors yet, but hopefully we'll be out soon. But I would begin to get together. I mean, there's two or three things I would do, literally, if I was just dropped in there. One is, I would start trying to figure out who are the other people like you. We're the like-minded people for starters. I'd probably get together and start a book group locally. I'd actually figure out some text that you want to read, just because a book group is an excuse for conversation with a broader group of people, and it gives you focus. And then I would start to read a handful of things that are very focused, the topic of like, how do we rebuild and reclaim a more progressive future from the jaws of sort of right-wing and conservative folks who are moving into, if we think about Southern Virginia and West Virginia, as you say, it's a lot the way Bill described, like it was a preview in my mind of those tectonic plates that we're seeing sort of globally right now, right? These are once resource rich, now kind of natural resource starved because we obliterated them. Having worked at the Highlander Center, I can tell you I spent right over the border in Tennessee. I spent a lot of time in Southern Virginia and in West Virginia, like a familiar area to me from my 20s in terms of organizing. And we were organizing people on the hollers in Appalachia in that region. When I was a younger organizer around a lot of environmental disruption and environmental damage and human health and human poisoning. And so but since then, the teachers movement work has been really interesting. So I want to build two threads together, how the teachers in West Virginia began to build their movement was, one, they started with the list, some of them started with the list of everyone who had been active in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And the Sanders campaign picks up very interesting bedfellows, right, in places like Virginia and Southern Virginia and West Virginia. So look for where there may be lists of people who are ready to do something different. In the case of the teachers in West Virginia, they began a book group that started to involve a whole bunch of people who had come off of volunteering for the Sanders campaign. Now that's West Virginia, but there's plenty of people in Virginia who would be similar. And they got a book group and they began to plot and plan, how are they going to do something different? Many of the teachers in West Virginia are the sons and daughters, a lot of a lot of coal miners. And so what's interesting to me is, if you started to go to all the coal miners where they were strong and you started to knock on the doors of the former leaders, there's gonna be a lot of older folks, right, retiring folks, and say, where are your kids? Literally, where are they? Because if they're anywhere near you in Southern Virginia, I'd start by talking to the grandparents and the parents of the Strong Mine Workers Union, plotting relationship to their children and their offspring in general. And then I would begin a study group, and I would begin to start getting people together who want to actually do something different and form an organization that's going to begin to work on whether it's a human health crisis, whether it's an unemployed council, and what do we deserve as the unemployed council? Why are our people, having bailed the country out of a couple world wars in terms of resources that you took from us, why do our people deserve nothing right now? That's actually not fair. If you got veterans down there, we just gave our lives for a war. So part of, my first book was called Expectations. Part of what people have to do is come to appreciate that they actually are deserving of a better life than they've been left with in a lot of poor areas in the United States. So get them together, start a book group, plot where you're going to start, and begin to make a set of issues. Like, if we could change 2 things in our town tomorrow, what would they be? And what would it require us to do that? Greater veterans benefits, Medicare for all, mental health services, a jobs program, a Green New Deal program.
Mira, también hay esto.
There's endless demands that people could be making right now, but if they're
No, es que
it's not going to work
es un concepto equivocado de felicidad.
globally.
Cliff, we're going to have to put everybody on mute. Thanks. Jane, did you finish?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that's literally what I would be doing, is looking to all those constituencies, and I would start charting and start building relationships and come up with a set of issues, of 3 issues, and start moving.
Let me add to that, because I think I couldn't disagree at all with what Jane just laid out. I think that there's some additional things. One thing is trying to do an analysis of the media in the area. What do people listen to and read? And are there, for example, public radio stations, or is it possible to set up low power FM stations in the area where you could begin a process of building alternative media? And I don't think that can be underestimated in terms of its relative importance. In the old days, we would be talking about creating newspapers and getting those around. And to some extent, that might be of some value, but much less now than it would have 20, 30 years ago. So I would add on to what Jane was saying there. I do think that this issue about the unemployed and economic development is something that we have to really look at. And I keep suggesting to progressives that we make use of the Supreme Court decision from the 90s, I think it was, that basically said that eminent domain can be utilized for purposes of economic development. And this was very important. It was based on something that was done in Connecticut. There was a fight. Someone was trying to set up a mall or something, and there was opposition to that. The Supreme Court said that if there was a justified economic development purpose, you could do it. You can use eminent domain. So why don't we run candidates for office with the idea of grabbing abandoned property, land, etc., for the purposes of economic development. Further, in your state, is there a redevelopment authority from which you could get money for, these states, particularly Republicans, always want to talk about giving money for business development. Well, what if we start setting up cooperatives? And so we connect that with the issue of eminent domain. So the idea is that we've got to think broadly. And so going full circle, we're back to what Jane was saying, it all begins with developing a core. There is no shortcut. If you don't have a core, none of the rest of this works. There is no silver bullet. So there's got to be a core, and that core really does have to be committed to, in your case, David, organizing in Southwestern Virginia. Not just as, let me put it like this. A few years ago, I gave a talk in Texas, and people were telling me about how bad the situation was in Texas. It was miserable. We're losing. So then they said to me, so what should we do? Right? Which, it's very flattered that people think that I have that wisdom. So I said to them, how do we take over Texas? And there was silence in the room. Everyone thought that I had either lost my mind or I had smoked some very strong herb, right? And I said, no, seriously. The question that we need to be facing is, how do we take over Texas? Not how bad the situation is. We all know how bad the situation is. So what cities do we have to win? What social movements do we have to unite with? What counties are essential? What counties are not essential? Who are the key opinion makers? See, this is the kind of thinking that I think we have to engage in, but it all begins with a core.
Okay, we have a question here that has come in from the YouTube audience. Let me put it up for you. It's from Maitsu Louis, who asks, on the question of labor's incomplete analysis of neoliberal trade agreements, which is to only talk about the harm to U.S. workers. From Mexico and elsewhere to meet U.S. workers, as Jane suggests, what demands should labor be making that benefit workers in all the countries in the agreements? The U.S.-Mexico-Canada side agreement has things that Mexico is supposed to do to protect labor, but nothing to protect U.S. workers, particularly migrant workers. How should labor be building organizational connection and joint demands from workers in both countries in their sector? Okay, Bill, Jane?
So this is from Meju, and thank you, Meju, for posing this question. I think that there's how to start. I think that the first thing is actually that in the United States, we need to have internal education within the ranks so that US workers better understand global capitalism and particularly better understand the impact of these trade agreements. So one of the examples that I frequently use is about NAFTA, the original NAFTA, and that Mexican migration spiked to the United States after NAFTA went into effect. But in order to understand that, you have to understand the devastation that NAFTA brought to the Mexican economy. Most US workers have not a clue about that. And they are therefore very susceptible to the kind of Trump propaganda that everybody, it's sort of this kind of Charlie Brown thing. why is everybody always messing with me, right? It's this notion that the United States is being picked on by the rest of the world, as opposed to that workers are getting squeezed around the planet, and that the United States is directly complicit, if not the architect of this. So that's one of the critical things that needs to happen. Now, the United Electrical Workers is one of the few unions, albeit a small one, that has been doing cross-border work for years. And I think that that is illustrative of the kind of work that needs to happen. It's about solidarity work, but also we've got to be looking at joint bargaining issues and organizing. And we have to be placing demands, like in the whole fight that went on around the renewal of NAFTA. One of the things that I found most disappointing was precisely what Meju identified, which was that you had US unions, including the National AFL-CIO, that were applauding the various demands on Mexico to improve working conditions, but were very silent about what was actually going to happen here. And so it seems to me that obviously what should have happened is some real demands in terms of reforming NAFTA that included the conditions for workers here, but also things like environmental agreements, impact of these trade agreements on the environment. So that's a direction that I would propose.
Jane, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, and it's just an add-on because, again, I'm in full agreement with Bill's general notion here. But I think just reflecting back on the work I was doing when I was working in the South at this well-known in sort of US, well-known in the civil rights movement, sort of adult education center called the Highlander Center. You know, there was some very smart work that was going on there. There was a group at the time called the Tennessee Industrial Renewal Network, which turned into like an anti-plant closing project. And they were some of the first groups that we began to work with, grassroots organizations that were labor-based organizations, trying to help begin to have mostly white, though frankly also some Black workers in the South who were losing factory jobs. This is before the German auto plants began to come into the South, right? It was gap years back in the 90s. And it really, it would not literally take more than the United Electrical Workers that Bill mentions were a part of this cross-border work that we were doing when they were one of the unions that was part of it. But it really wouldn't take more than a single Mexican worker being in the room with a single US worker whose job was going to Mexico, and this is 30 years ago, for them to very quickly come to the conclusion without anyone having to tell them anything. All they had to do was have a discussion about what are your conditions, what are our conditions? What's the livelihood that your family has? What's the livelihood that your family has? What do they pay you? What are they paying you? Like, it doesn't actually take very long for workers who I generally regard as smart people, generally speaking, to come to the conclusion that someone's not talking straight with them about what the problem is, right? So I don't actually think it is that hard for workers in a conversation to learn. If we set up the educational environment correctly, if we're constantly thinking that every organizing campaign is an educational opportunity, every educational opportunity is an organizing campaign, right? In my brain, those things are linked together. It doesn't take very long to work around sort of what we think of as hard issues and have workers begin to realize not only is the problem not your one country, the problem isn't even per se trade deals. The problem is a murderous level of greed among global corporations. And the sooner workers come to understand that they're all being chewed up by the same corporations who are using the same racist, nationalist, misogynist rift against them, the sooner they get together and campaign together as one big sort of workers movement. And for the last sort of half a year, I've been doing some very deliberate international sort of online training schools through the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung out of Germany. And I am very clear every time thousands of workers from all over the world get on a call together, just ordinary folks getting on a call, trying to figure it out, that it's not very hard to shift the blame to where it needs to squarely be, which is a handful of way too wealthy CEOs and corporate leaders who are stealing wealth from everybody. So what's our organizing plan going to be to push back on them? And it's definitely got to be a global list in mind, international list in our mentality and our politics and our principles movement that functions though very locally, region by region, fight by fight, state by state, et cetera. And maybe I'll just close on one more example of this, related but different. In a big campaign that I was running in Las Vegas, speaking of the Southwest, one part of the South that Bill was talking about, this is in the early part of this century. And we had, for the first time, so it was the Western side of the United States, we had thousands of nurses who the employers were flying in on temporary visas from the Philippines, who were working in up and down the Western states in the hospitals. And there was a moment, fast forward, white and Filipina, like not a lot of different ethnicities that were mixed into a few big hospitals I was working with in Nevada in the early part of the 2000s. And there was a moment heading towards a strike vote, what was going to be the first strike in a hospital in Las Vegas ever. And a bunch of white nurses said, well, you know, it turns out those Filipinos aren't going to go on strike because they're on these H-1 visas and the employer's telling them that they're going to just send them all home. And it was a moment where, you know, you could either walk away and lose the campaign or you could really get at the issues, right? And we weren't interested in losing the campaign. So we were like, we had to go. And then they were complaining about the Filipinos speaking in Tagalog in their own language. And within several minutes, you could work the sort of white nurses who were harboring obviously some racist ideas about the Filipino nurses. You could begin to say to the white nurses, why do you think your employer has all the Filipinos working in the hospital, for an internationalist moment? And they would say, well, to pay them less. And I would say, right, to pay who less? And they would say to pay them less. And I would say, but ultimately, who are they going to pay less if they're paying them less? And they would say, well, yeah, they're going to pay all of us less. And then I would say, so what do you think the best way to overcome that is? Do you think if all of you organize the union together and fight for one really great contract together, regardless of who it is, that you maybe are actually going to overcome this employer and have a better quality of life? And of course, the answer was yes. So my point is, it's never actually that hard when you treat workers like grown-ups and engage in really hard conversations and frame the questions in the educational process in just such a way. We very quickly had Filipina and white nurses overcoming all sorts of historic antagonisms in that campaign and coming out united and strong and victorious and overcoming a lot of bad ideas that people had initially about each other. We just have to do the work. It's actually not that hard.
Okay, we have a question next from Gregory Diamant. And after that, then Kate Poe has been waiting with a question. Gregory?
Thank you very much to the speakers. It's been so much rich material that I'm absorbing and making me think. And there's so many things I could ask about, but I'm going to pick one topic which I brought up in the past, and that concerns the police and the military, where power resides to a great extent. I'm originally a New York City boy, and in speaking to some New York police people, one of them looked at me and said, you know, I'm a working class person. And I was thinking of what Jane said earlier about all these areas where do your kids go to school, what's going on, where do you live, gentrification, all of these things, so on. And how does one get in, and especially with the very right-wing attitude of a lot of the police unions that we've seen, how do we go in, or how can one go in and organize them and bring a progressive message to the people who are exercising on a very daily basis power to so many communities? And secondly, of course, I think about the military and the military bases. So all of these questions have to do around this power, and how does one go in and start to neutralize it? Because it has always been in history that you have seen that the police, the military, and so forth have been the main forces used to oppress people. So I'm going to stop there and let you guys say something about that.
Um, well, I think it's two very different categories, the police and the military. Um, with regard to the police, the potential wedge with police are the caucuses of minority police officers, like the Black Police Associations, things like that, because they're the ones that, this doesn't mean that Black police get a pass, but it means that Black police associations tend to be the ones that's subject to a lot of pressure from the community, and they are frequently at odds with the established union, the police department, whichever the union happens to be, fraternal order of police or whoever. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it's not a priority. That the priority is much more in terms of organizing white workers outside of the repressive apparatus to understand the danger of this particular moment. Now, with the military is much more complex because of why people are there, how long they're there, and the incredible diversity in the military. It's one of the things that I think helps. If the military was more consolidated, we might have in fact seen a coup, a successful coup. But I think that my read is that the military is unreliable from the standpoint of, at this point at least, overthrowing the state. The kind of organizing that needs to be done in the military is something that mainly needs to be done inside. And one of the things that's very different than when I was growing up during the Vietnam era was that you could appeal to a lot of draftees, people who were really uncomfortable with what was going on. Now you have a military of volunteers, and even though they may be economic volunteers, i.e. they've gone in there because there's the absence of jobs, that's very different in terms of how one approaches organizing. So I don't have very good ideas there. I think that I spoke earlier, and Jane did as well, about organizing veterans. One of the things about organizing veterans is the level of bitterness that many veterans, particularly combat veterans, feel about their experience. And that bitterness needs to be interpreted. In other words, we need to help people interpret what was going on and why. Because the bitterness, for example, that German veterans felt at the end of World War I flipped within 10 years into a bitterness that the Nazis were able to take advantage of. Whereas in the beginning, it was very anti-war and quite sympathetic to the left. So that's why, again, I'm much more focused on the issue of veterans. But there's a broader question from what you're raising, Greg, which is about the question of the white worker. And I think that fundamentally, we on the left have to be convinced that it's in the material interest of white workers to oppose racism. To the extent to which we don't believe that, it's over. The only appeal you can make under those circumstances is very narrow and very moralistic. I take the position that it's in the material interest of white workers, and I'm talking about white people in general, I'm talking about white workers, to actively oppose racism and to oppose the racial differential in treatment because of the impact that it has on the working class as a whole. That to me seems to be, that's the direction I believe that union organizing and left organizing among workers needs to take.
Yeah, I just want to back up Brother Bill there. I mean, and I maybe want to back him up in one key way, Gregory, which is a hard one to say, but I think that's why I want to say it, which is the question of prioritization. Like, I do think it matters. I do think the issue you're raising is, serious and real. But in one of the things that the progressive and left do not do very well, or any sectors of our progressive movement generally, is prioritize. And so prioritization really matters. So I do think it matters. And I think Bill laid out the ways that I would be approaching the caucuses within the COPs, et cetera. But it doesn't strike me that that's the most urgent work we have to do right now. And I think that the example of sort of how I approached nurses who had some real racist issues against the Filipinos in the big hospital campaigns we were running is sort of an easy roadmap, right, to how to do it. I mean, it was literally just from changing the question to, why do you think the boss is flying in, airplane loads of Filipinos to work in your hospitals? And then their first reaction is to pay them less. Great. What do you think that's going to do to your pay next? It's a pretty simple, unless she's dumb, because a lot of women I work with, right? Unless that white nurse is being dumb, which she's not, she's realizing right in the answer to that question, she's got to take some responsibility for what's going on in her workplace and her own attitude. And whenever people talk to me about, well, they just go off and speak in Tagalog, I hear this like attitude. This is so typical in the beginning of a campaign when workers haven't yet built solidarity, right? That's why the job of the organizer is to help them build it. It's the questions we ask that get them to have a different conclusion than the one they had before we had the conversation with them, right? So that they begin to realize, their allies are these Filipino nurses. And maybe if they ask them nicely and start talking to them in English nicely, maybe they would not just speak Tagalog in the break room, right? So, overcoming racism, to me, it's like one campaign at a time, and it's not hard. I mean, it's a lot less hard in my life experience than it is in our imagination, because it just doesn't take that long in a campaign where there's self-interest at stake to forge collective interest, which then builds solidarity, which then just breaks down not the origins, but it breaks down a lot of serious racist stuff in a practical way. My life experience in every campaign, we can seriously break the racism down and help people recenter how they come to understand what the collective is and who's part of that with them. And I think that's the goal of every organizing campaign.
Okay, Kate Poe, do you have sound? Can you ask your own question? I'll put it up here on the screen. She was having trouble with her Zoom sound. My question is about capacity in the aftermath of the fracturing of the AFL-CIO. Which unions right now are investing in the kind of organizing that you are describing that can best take on, for lack of a better word, Trump populism? And in what parts of the US, how can we best follow what they are doing?
This is a tough question. And I'm not sure, Kate, I'm going to answer it correctly. I'm going to say something that may sound silly. I think, frankly, that every union can take on right-wing populism. And that those that don't are, it's fundamentally about cowardice. It's not about capacity. Because it's really about the kind of leadership and education that is advanced by that organization. I'm tired of hearing unions apologize for not being able to do more educational programs, yet they find goo gobs of money to do electoral campaigns and to have all kinds of celebrations. No, I think that the resources are there. So, and frankly, any union that wanted to do it, they should give me a call and I'll give them a great deal. The second thing is where it's trickier about the fracturing of the labor movement. And I'm really interested in what Jane has to say on this. I think, see, the AFL-CIO has never been a federation. It's been a confederation. It's much looser than a federation. And this is something that John Sweeney, when he and his team were elected in 1995, underestimated. And they, to a great extent, acted as if the AFL-CIO was like a large union. It's not. It's a fragile alliance. And the affiliates, by and large, don't have to go along with what the National AFL-CIO wants to do, which means that you have to really build within the National AFL-CIO a solid core, which initially Sweeney had, that advances and supports the kind of change that's necessary. In the absence of that, you have what Rich Trumka does, which is that his leadership is tolerated, but not supported. And the difference is very fundamental. So I think that the unions like AFSCME, I mean, SEIU is out of the AFL-CIO, but they don't really have a good reason for being out. The steelworkers are the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, are several of the larger unions. Then there's others that can play a very important role, like the Amalgamated Transit Union, and a few others, American Federation of Government Employees, that can play a more positive role. But this is where the vision question comes in. What is the vision for the national labor movement? And I don't see much out there. You know, you have Sarah Nelson from Communication Workers Union, which is another excellent union, by the way, and large. But Sarah Nelson is out of the flight attendants part of the communication workers. And, you know, she's good. I'm not sure, though, that I think that there needs to be more there in terms of her vision about the transformation. I think people have to understand that we have to radically transform the way we practice unionism. It's not just about who is at the top. It really is a level of rethinking of what do we do with these federations and how do we understand trade unionism? And if Sarah and others are prepared to push that question, then I think that there's real hope. If they're not, I think that what will end up happening is further fragmentation. It will just be further fragmentation. Yeah. Jane, what do you think?
Hello, Kate Poe, wherever you are. I think a few things. I mean, when you were speaking, I realized there's this weird. I think it's historical. So, but I do think it's a bit odd, but I also think it's real analogy between sort of like how Sweeney and the AFL-CIO approached what we hoped was going to be a change process. And then sort of like the analogy in the United States, so like there's the federal government and then there's quote unquote states' rights. And it's sort of a weak federal government in some ways, but also not in other ways. It's a lot of like the way that our national unions, our National Trade Confederation organized, which is the affiliates have most of the power, meaning that the individual unions have most of the power in the national labor movement. So what I think are a few things. One is, I think we learned the lesson in the years that Bill and I, and Kate was in and out of there somewhere too, I think herself at the AFL-CIO, I think we learned that the change is not going to come from a super top-down route, given what we just said about sort of the analogy of the affiliates have the power, they can't just be told something, just like states can't just be told something on many issues in the United States. So it puts the burden on real organizing inside of each union and then across the unions. That's sort of sort of these ideas of these central labor councils across the United States, which in theory are a great place to get some work done because it brings together a lot of local rank and file leaders who often are not prone to the sort of high level fighting or turf wars that are going on in Washington, DC. But to answer it, I don't think there's any national union right now who I would say is doing the work that needs to be done in this moment. I think that there are a lot of local unions some state-based organizations within some unions who actually are doing really, really, really good work. And we're seeing them because they're the ones who are bursting on the scene more often than not in real supermajority strikes. So watching any union in the United States that's pulling off what we call a supermajority strike, I don't mean just ones using the word strike as a sort of protest word, I mean actually engaging in supermajority strikes where the community is standing with them, that's a union that we should actively support and stand with. And fortunately, there are an increasing number of unions that are figuring out how to return to the supermajority strike. And I, for one, think that that's urgent. It could not be more urgent in this moment. And maybe I'll close with a quick analogy as to why, which underscores a lot of what I think Bill opened up with. I spent a lot of 2019 organizing in spending literal time and being in Germany. And part of the first reason that I went over to Germany, one was because they had translated my book, No Shortcuts, into German, which led to just a lot of interest in the ideas that were being put out in my second book. When I got there, though, not on the first trip, I began to hear about Nazis and the AfD, which is sort of, not officially Nazis, but okay, unofficially, it's the new Nazis in Germany, the political party called Alternative to Deutschland, right, AfD. By my third trip to Germany, a set of German organizers wanted me to come to a place on the Polish-German border where one of the largest auto plants sits in Germany. This would be formerly part of East Germany. And I went to work there, and the reason why I went to do a couple of day training in this like remote, literally almost looking at Poland on the border. And the reason why I was asked to go there was because there were AfD members, meaning sort of contemporary Nazi folks, who were beginning to compete and run for office in what's called the German Works Council elections. Works councils are what people in the US think of as this like, great, hip, easy new idea. If we just had works councils like they do in Germany, things would be fine in the United States. My hint here is the answer to that is no, that's not true. Having spent a lot of time now in Germany. And essentially in the training, people said to me, we're doing the traditional go around in the room, hi, tell me your name and one reason you're here and what you'd like to get out of this training. And to a person, they said, we would like to learn a better way to have a more successful conversation than the Nazis are having in the plant about why it's important to go on strike to take on the bosses. And I was stunned. This is the opening round in a 2-day training. And the one thing all the German organizers wanted to learn was how to speak more effectively and engage with workers more effectively than the contemporary small N Nazis who were running around the Polish-German border running a rap. And here's what their rap was. The rap was, the German state has failed you. The German trade unions have failed you, who haven't had a strike out there in ever since reunification. And so we, the AfD, are prepared to go on strike and strike for what we, the Germans, deserve, which is all about getting the Poles out of the plant, by the way, right? Because there are a lot of Polish workers coming in to play the same role as the Filipino nurses that the bosses were bringing in the hospital I described to you. So I just think we cannot underestimate how the most basic skills are urgently needed, whether it's in the United States, between Filipino nurses and white nurses, or whether it's on the border of Poland between German workers and Polish workers. Our movement, our unions have an obligation to do work that can literally help people punch through conversations just like that, which we were able to do in Germany, just like we were able to do in Nevada. So, it's a long answer to yes, and I want to go back to my basic point, which is it's about the fundamentals of how do we approach the work. So to Kate's point, look for the unions in the US who are running supermajority strikes, who have community support behind them, and support them actively. Because the more people see them winning, the more supermajority strikes we're going to have, where people are necessarily, to get to 100% out of all the workers, working through racism, sexism, and a whole lot of issues that otherwise the employer class uses to divide them. We need a lot more of sort of the teachers level strikes that we've seen in the last couple of years in the US.
Okay, before we go on to the next question from John Lawrence, let me put the email address up on the screen again For those of you who are watching on YouTube, this will be your last chance to get a question in. Send it to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. But right now, here in the Zoom room, we have a question from John Lawrence. Hi, John.
Hi. I was wondering, how can unions and other mass left organizations create structures and processes for maximizing participatory democracy in which ordinary members can devise goals, strategy, and tactics in an ongoing way? Are there any model mass democratic organizations in the United States or globally?
Well, I would start by saying I don't look at unions as left organizations. That may sound semantical, but unions are, they can be led by leftists, but there's nothing particularly intrinsic about them that makes them left. And there's different forms of trade unionism. So I want to start there just because I think that there's often assumptions about unions since their stated purpose is to organize workers. And those assumptions we should jettison. To your question, there's a number of unions that I have known or worked with that have engaged in varying levels of strategic planning. And where I've seen it work very well at the local and sometimes the national level is where it is an inclusive process where there is real room for debate, where there is diversity, and I don't mean just simply demographic, but thinking about the union as a whole, and it is well facilitated. One of the things, though, that makes democratic participation complicated is that, and this is something that people on the left often avoid dealing with, you need time to participate. I mean, literally, you need time. You need to be able to not simply squeeze in a few minutes here, a few minutes there in order to engage in a meeting, let alone to read something. To be involved in real planning, there is research that needs to be done by somebody. And that research needs to be read and discussed. And so if an organization does not put into place a means for that to happen, the planning, the engagement becomes superficial. I saw that early on when years ago, almost 30 years ago, when I started doing strategic planning, and I was doing what I realized later was very superficial. People enjoyed it though. In some ways, I entertained people because I got them involved. They were able to talk about their experiences. But what I ultimately realized was a couple of things. One was that we were spreading around existing knowledge, but not introducing new knowledge. We were also sometimes spreading around myth and not challenging myth. And then there was issues of follow-up. You can develop, you can have great discussions, but if there's insufficient follow-up, then it basically all ends up being bullshit. And so I think that there is much more to participation than we on the left often identify. And this is why I think we have to be careful when you talk about participatory democracy. Sometimes people counterposing it to representative democracy. There are moments in history when masses of people engage in struggles and vast democratic discussions. The Soviets in the 1917 and 1919, let's say, or the German Soviets around the same period, various communes that arose in the Chinese Revolution. There's plenty of other examples. But when there is a downturn in struggle, people generally return to everyday life and they are less engaged, and the institutions that have often been built at the high point start to deteriorate. And so this is one of the reasons that we've got to be thinking really long term about how to engage people, which I think that's one of the reasons I think counterposing participatory democracy and representative democracy is really missing the point. A long answer.
Okay, do we have any, Jane?
No, I could go on, but I think Bill hit it. I mean, I think that I think in my second book, though, to the question that John asked, I think in my second book, In No Shortcuts, I outline some of the fundamental differences between what I think of as more participatory, like what's the constitution of a union literally, that at least is inviting active participation. And that actually helps. Like it really helps if the basic constitution bylaws of the local union is the kind of organization that actively seeks and creates the space and looks for that high participation. Even if it doesn't always sustain itself at the level and the way that Bill described, I think that that's right. When I was a young trade union organizer, I remember one of the most important lessons I learned. We had just been organizing a whole bunch of new nursing homes, childcare centers, whole bunch of stuff. This is back in Connecticut in the 90s. And then we had the housing fight that was going on, and it was a very dynamic time, and huge participation, huge turnout at meetings. By the way, I will say, not just as it mattered to have a constitution that invites that kind of engagement. You don't want a constitutional barrier to it. But you also, there are little things that you can do. And I'll just say them for a second, because I was thinking of it as I was picturing a big meeting in Stanford. We did basic stuff. Translation at every meeting. We had 4 different languages that were spoken routinely among our rank and file base, right? From Haitian Creole to Spanish. So make sure you're actually translating. Set up childcare for meetings. There's a lot of basic things that facilitate the participation that Bill is mentioning. So that's crucial. Can't skip those steps. But at the end of the day, I remember this moment when my mentor at the time came up to me and said, I won't use the curse words he did just because, we're in public, but you can imagine it was laced with some curse words. And he said, Maccabee, the average worker does not come to work every day to start the revolution. That's what you and the organizers are doing, right? The average worker is coming to work to have a really productive, good day at work, to get respected by their employer, to get compensated decently, and to go home and have a fair and decent life, which is part of why I like the whole worker organizing approach, because it doesn't let us separate the going home from the good life, right? The quality of life at home and the quality of life at work, we should see as one, but we shouldn't expect people either because they don't have time, although even in a fair world where they have more time. I like to build the kind of robust workplace organization that engages so many good workers that they sort of understand that they're going to rotate in and out. In between the big fights, they're going to rotate in and out in a really serious way. And then there's also a way that we approach the day-to-day work inside the workplace, which I've written a lot about, which is, do we use an organizing approach day in and day out to how we solve workplace problems in between the big fights? So there are a lot of things that we can do that support active participation. But I think Bill's right to say we can't always expect it. It's, do we have structures in place that support it and encourage it and sort of demand it when it's needed? And do we then have a level of organization for the in-between times that's actually very good and small d democratic, and where, contract bargaining is open to the whole workforce? And there's all sorts of barometers I use when I think about the criteria for healthy, good governance. Mindful that not every worker is coming to work every day to have a revolution, right? That's just it's a good thing to keep in mind. So
Let me put a question into the hopper. City and even state governments are facing major fiscal crises. With the pandemic, revenues are down and expenses are up. And so it's expected that they will have to, and in many cases already are, laying off city employees. How should public service worker unions respond to this?
tax the rich. No, really. I mean,
Yes.
honestly, I do I seriously believe that, right? So, I mean, I'm involved in a lot of planning right now that is about who we're going to tax to stave off austerity at the state level. So, in the state of California, for sake of argument, where I'm doing a lot of work, where we are, we just got the first glimpse of the governor's budget. What I would say is that there are not, in many states, there are not going to be cities and states, there are not going to be radical austerity measures in probably in the next few months, because they're sitting on some money from the CARES Act last year, and they're sitting on what were relatively speaking, kind of flush budgets that had been taking place in a lot of the states up until the COVID crisis began. What we understand is going to happen is that it's going to be the next budget cycle. Unless something happens federally, it's going to be the spring of 2022 in most state budgets, which then will lead to municipal budgets as well, where stuff is going to really start to crash, unless there's a very serious federal bailout, which can only be precipitated by undoing the 2017 tax cuts, pumping all that money back into the system, and then taxing the super rich and the corporations even more federally. It's hard for, as I say in the opening of the Nation piece, it's hard for me to imagine the sort of bipartisan Wall Street, Silicon Valley class that's taken a root in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that they're going to let that happen very easily. So I think when you look at a place like California, New York, which is different than Southern Virginia or West Virginia, but when you start to look at these states, the next step for whether it's the teachers unions and the strikes, or whether it's healthcare workers or anyone who's had some serious success recently, or whether it's people on the ground in Georgia, it's how are we going to force taxes on the corporations and the super rich? I think a pandemic tax would be so appropriate right now federally, not just in key states where we are seeing billionaires and the tech elite couldn't be richer at the expense of many people dying. So learning how to have building the power to tax the rich is not a throwaway line. For me, it's a very serious planning tool day in and day out. We didn't do so well because of the pandemic. I think in a short analysis of a longer analysis, we came up short in a big plan to break Prop 13 in California on the ballot by it was such a close vote. In Oregon and Florida and a whole bunch of states in Arizona, they actually did succeed at taxing the rich. So we've got to look for where we're winning ballot initiatives, where we're winning local initiatives to tax the rich, and do a hell of a lot more. And frankly, be able to go on strike to tax the rich. So I think that's all got to go together in one. We're not going to have anything left of any public service anywhere.
And I'm going to just add, first of all, I'm going to have to sign off because I owe my granddaughter a walk around the block. And so I'm going to have to sign off. I agree 100% with what Jane said. And I think that one of the difficulties, I know in California, they attempted to overturn a very regressive tax proposal. Had there not been the COVID pandemic, I think it's very possible that they would have won. We have to look strategically at how to move against a certain thinking that exists in the United States about taxes and at the popular level. And it sort of plays itself out when you have poor people that will oppose tax increases on the rich because they'll make the argument, well, at some point, I might be rich too. Now, that may sound absurd, but it's actually very, very powerful force out there. One thing that I think points us in a better direction is where we can make targeted arguments. That is, who is going to be taxed and for what purpose? Taxing for improvement of public education, taxing for infrastructure, et cetera. But it's not going to be easy because the anti-tax forces are very well funded, very well organized. And what they're very successful in doing is scaring the bejeebies out of people. The idea that, this whole tax and spend thing. But there's one other aspect to this also, which is racial. The racial aspect is that the tax money, the money's going to be going to the undeserving. So in the aftermath of World War II, for example, you know, when you had things that had to be funded, like the GI Bill, white people could look at this and say, well, we're going to benefit. To the extent to which the right wing has been successful in convincing white people that taxes are not going towards them, but is going towards the undeserving, read the racially coded, even when it is in the interest of white working people, the working class and middle strata, there will be a voting against their interests. We're going to have to confront that directly. I don't think that you can walk around it, because it is one of those messages that it's a subliminal message in almost every anti-tax effort. And we often want to try to avoid it. So, but I'm going to have to apologize and excuse myself. I have a feeling that my colleague may also have to leave. And I want to thank the center very much for sponsoring this. And, you know, as I like to say, keep the faith.
Now, we've gone over our 90-minute anyway, so it is time to end. I want to give a great thanks to Bill and to Jane. Both have given excellent presentations that have left us with much to think about. This webinar, as well as past ones, will be available on our website, globaljusticecenter.org. And we've had some great ones, including one that that Bill was in, 2 months ago, on right-wing populism, authoritarianism, and fascism. You might want to check that out, because it has become even more timely as a result of last week's events. And many other good ones there too. Next week, we will have a webinar on another topic that we touched on today, namely public finance, how to finance what needs to be done. Well, we're going to be looking next week at the topic of the modern monetary theory. Is ending the pandemic slump, answered by MMT. Michael Roberts, a Marxist economist, will be our speaker on that topic. That's next Monday at 1 o'clock. Invite you all to come. And I want to thank everyone for their participation today, and hope that we will see you again next week. And for now, this is then Cliff Durand signing off.